arm comes out as well, and so then they can't continue to roll over. This reflex is present from birth through about age 2 to 6 months, and it's most prominent actually at around 4 months, and then it begins to fade or diminish after that. This reflex must diminish, or the baby will have difficulty learning to crawl, because when their arms and legs are bent, you actually have to turn your head towards the side where your bent arm is in order to get the crawling motion down. It's also important as we learn to write and to eat. When we write, we look towards the arm that is bent. When we eat, we have to be able to get our head to come towards our dominant hand so that we can get food to our mouth. When we see that this reflex has not sufficiently or fully diminished, it's going to be hard for children to learn to write or to read because they're not going to want to look towards that bent arm. So a lot of times what we'll see is compensation, that they will actually turn their paper backwards so that they can look the other way, or they'll put their paper the opposite direction so that they can try to write. So why is this reflex important? This is one of those that we could look at and say, why does the baby need to know to be able to do this when they're in the uterus? Well, what happens is that as the babies, here's where I need you. I have a helper with me tonight. Just hold it, yep, right there. Okay, and up just a little higher if you can, perfect. So when the baby starts coming down and is sitting in uterus right before they're born, they're actually facing to the side because the widest part of the pelvic inlet, it's called, this way, is widest from side to side, which matches with the longest dimension of the baby's head. So as they start to come down the birth canal, then the longest dimension when the baby is born is from front to back. So they actually have to turn their head 90 degrees in order to get their head to move around. Thank you for now. As they start descending then into the birth canal, as they turn their head and as the muscles and the bones turn that head that way, what happens when this arm goes up? This shoulder and these neck muscles are also brought up. So what happens is they turn and that shoulder comes. Now we have narrowed the dimension of the shoulders by putting them on a diagonal so that the shoulders can also maneuver around through the birth process, and then eventually make it easier for the shoulders to be born as well. That's the one I think is the neatest. Before we look at the next two reflexes that relate to birth, I need to give you a little more information about the interaction between the mother and the baby's body. As you can start to see that during this birth process with the mother and the baby interacting, the baby really does take over physiology. If we look at that from a hormonal standpoint, that's a whole nother complete lecture. But at this point even, how the mother and the baby are working together becomes very integral. As the baby continues to descend down the birth canal, the parietal bone, which is the bone on the side of the head, hits up against the mother's sacrum and stops. And then as the baby continues to try to descend, this will then actually start the overlapping of the cranial bones, which is known as cranial molding. So what will happen is one parietal bone will overlap the other, and then as the baby drops down a little bit more, then the frontal bone and the occipital bone will also slide over or under to make the baby's head smaller and more compact. This also moves the cranial fluid out of the brain area and forces it down into the spinal cord to narrow the circumference of the head. Then later when the baby is born, on the first breath, that stimulates the release of all of this cranial molding, and the fluid can come back up into the head, and that actually starts what is called the cranial rhythm, which continues during our whole life, the pumping of the cranial bones and the sacrum on the other end to move the fluid around the brain, down the spinal cord, and back up again, which is how the brain and spinal cord get all their nourishment. A whole nother topic of discussion. So then later, as the baby continues to descend, in births without episiotomies, there will also be a natural Heimlich maneuver, that the mother's muscles will squeeze around the chest of the baby, and the baby will expel any remaining fluid from their lungs, which will also serve to help narrow the chest cavity. So now, as we've had this systematic decrease in fluid and the moving of the volume of the fluid to help to narrow the baby, then this leads up to the next reflex, which is called Perez. In order to test for this one, if you hold the baby securely so that their head and stomach are still supported, face down, and if you stroke along their back from the tailbone, right on the bumps of the spine, from the tailbone up towards the head, the baby will arch their head back, extend their back, flex their knees, and urinate. So this last one helps to decrease the final fluid volume from the abdominal and pelvic cavity so that the baby can continue to descend and be born. This reflex is present from birth until about 24 months, but you will see them continue to arch and bring their knees up. And when this one reflex does not finally resolve, or failure to diminish, will result in enuresis, or what's called bedwetting, or sometimes daytime wetting, where the child has problems learning bladder control. Some of this can be stimulated that if the reflex remains, if there's anything that is stimulating the back of the child, like a waistband or something, a ticket or a tag rubbing on their back, that can stimulate their back and their spine enough that can cause them to go into an arched position. So especially if a child is sleeping in an arched position, that could help. They might have more of a problem with bedwetting as they get older due to the non-diminishing of this reflex. The next reflex is very similar, Gallant's reflex. We are again holding the baby face down, but this time instead of going up on the spine, we're going to move out to halfway between the middle of the spine and the side of the baby's body, and we're going to stroke down. And what will happen then is that the baby will bend their head and their hip will come up on that same side, and they'll go into extension as well.